Roman soldiers weren't always paid in coin. Sometimes they were paid in salt. The Latin word salarium, the root of salary, was never about flavor. It was about survival, trade, loyalty, and power. Salt today is an afterthought, a seasoning, something to tame the blandness of food. But that's a modern illusion. Past civilizations didn't taste salt, they calculated it, stored it, and fought over it. Salt was a unit of trust long before coins, long before borders. And there's the contradiction. The thing used to keep food from rotting has also rotted empires. Salt preserves, but it also burns. It sustains life, but it has been used to curse the soil, sterilize the earth, and erase entire cities. That's the fracture buried in the element itself. It doesn't symbolize purity. It symbolizes tension, the power to prevent decay and the power to make decay permanent. Salt doesn't just stop time, it freezes decisions. It locks a moment into permanence. That's why it was sacred, why it was feared, why it wasn't just used, but ritualized. And that's the contradiction we'll trace in the philosophies that praised it, the unsettled minds and the civilizations it both preserved and erased. Salt is simple. It doesn't grow, it doesn't rot, and it doesn't die, it just is. And for that reason, it doesn't belong in a living system. This is where philosophy begins to stumble, because salt violates the frameworks used to explain value, morality, even change itself. In the logic of ancient systems, what has value must degrade. Gold tarnishes, grain spoils. Time corrupts everything except salt. And yet salt has never been innocent. It purifies, but it also sterilizes. It was used in temples to cleanse offerings, but also on the fields of enemies to render their land uninhabitable. That duality isn't symbolic, it's structural. The same mineral that keeps the meat from decay makes soil infertile. The same thing that preserves can also erase. To Plato, the soul had a natural order, rational, spirited, and appetitive. But salt resists that neat layering. It's not rational. It doesn't produce. It's not spirited. It doesn't fight. It's not appetitive. It doesn't hunger. And yet every civilization with a spiritual logic gave it power, not because it fit, but because it didn't. Religions have long claimed purity is something to strive for. One ought to have a clean hand and clean a heart. However, salt enters that conversation not as a virtue, but as a threat. Salt purifies by annihilation. It doesn't remove corruption. It removes what can be corrupted. That's not cleansing, that's exclusion, which is why it sits so uncomfortably next to moral systems that want to redeem. And so the paradox sharpens. Why was something so absolute treated as holy? Why did so many traditions see in salt a kind of sacred necessity, even as it burned the very ground it touched? That's not a rhetorical problem, that's a metaphysical one. And it gets worse when you realize this wasn't abstract. Salt was traded for, prayed over, spread on wounds, rubbed into the skin, offered to gods, and thrown into fire. In every culture, salt moved between the physical and the sacred as if the line didn't exist. But that's the line we're taught to trust. And that trust begins to falter, not just in ritual, but in the psyche. Salt enters through the tongue, but it never leaves quietly. It lingers in the blood, the sweat, the tear ducts. It floods the body, maps the nerves, haunts the thresholds of survival. That's the part philosophy forgets. Salt isn't just symbolic, it's felt in trauma, in dehydration, in addiction, in the cracked lips of the dying and the wet cheeks of the mourning. The human body can't live without salt, but it also can't survive too much of it. That tension isn't abstract, it's physiological. The line between balance and collapse is measured in grains. Psychologically, salt behaves like a control. In small doses, it stabilizes, it calms chaos. But in excess, it corrodes flexibility. It hardens the system, makes things brittle, unchanging. And there's the fracture. What purifies also rigidifies. The mind that seeks too much order begins to calcify, to cling to rituals, to freeze emotions, to preserve relationships that no longer breathe, like salting meat for a famine that never comes. Salt, in this sense, isn't a substance. It's a defense mechanism. The trauma survivor doesn't crave clarity. They crave structure, something incorruptible, something that can't surprise them. And salt is incorruptible. It won't spoil, it won't soften. It gives the illusion of permanence in a world that otherwise slips through the fingers. But permanence has a price. Salted soil doesn't grow. That's the paradox internalized. The more we try to preserve ourselves from pain, the more we become uninhabitable. No wonder it shows up in our tears, sweat, and blood. The fluids that leak out in pain, labor, or loss are filled with salt. The body tries to process what the mind can't, but salt doesn't explain. It marks, stains, and remains after the emotion has passed, like residue on the skin. It's not the memory of pain, it's the aftermath. And that's where the symbolism becomes unbearable. Because if salt is the cost of survival, then what does it mean to live in a body covered in it? Civilizations didn't just use salt, they built with it. They buried gods in it. They taxed it, traded it, and spilled blood over it. Salt roots stretched across continents before anyone named them. From the Sahara to the Himalayas, from the Venetian lagoons to the Chinese coast, salt shaped geopolitics long before oil ever did. But the deeper story isn't trade, it's mythology. In the Hebrew Bible, Lot's wife is turned to salt, not ash, not dust, salt, a substance that preserves but also punishes. Her fate is often read as disobedience, but symbolically, it's stasis. She looked back, she froze, she became the very element that stops time. In ancient Japan, sumo wrestlers purify the ring with salt before a match. It's not superstition, it's architecture. The ring becomes sacred, untouchable, defined by what cannot rot. The Egyptians used salt in mummification. The Greeks offered it to the gods. Medieval Europe built entire economies around it. In India, the British taxed it so cruelly that Gandhi made salt the centerpiece of civil disobedience. Not bread, not water, salt. Because control over salt was control over bodies. And yet, even in reverence, civilizations feared what salt implied, that something could be both sacred and barren. In some African tribes, salt was a dowry, in others a weapon. In Incan rituals, salt was poured into wounds as both medicine and message, to purify and to remind. Salt was invited into the most intimate rites, birth, death, and sacrifice, not because it was understood, but because it refused to be. And that refusal became civilizational logic. Every culture that touched salt projected its own values onto it, then punished itself when salt didn't behave accordingly. That's the mirror. Salt doesn't change, the stories around it do. It reflects back exactly what a culture believes about preservation, purity, and control. But that mirror cuts both ways, because if salt corrupts nothing, then whatever is corrupted must already carry the seed of its own ruin. Salt has no agenda. It doesn't favor the sacred or the profane. It doesn't reward virtue or punish failure. It just acts. It enters, preserves, and burns. And that maybe is the real discomfort, because in salt there's no redemption arc, no moral weighting, no cosmic balance sheet, only consequence, preservation without judgment, destruction without malice. This is why salt unsettles. It defies narrative. It won't be folded into a clean story about good and evil. It just marks what was and makes it stay. To those who crave order, salt feels holy. To those who fear rigidity, it feels like death. But the mineral doesn't change. Only the context shifts. The battlefield, the kitchen, the altar, the wound. And yet salt doesn't create meaning. It traps it. And perhaps that's why civilizations ritualized it. Not because it elevated the moment, but because it locked it in. The body remembers salt because the mind needs closure. And salt looks like closure, but it's not. It's only the sealing of a door. What's left behind still festers. What's ahead is still unknown. So salt lingers in soil, in skin, in scripture, and in symbols, not as an answer, but as residue. The aftertaste of control, the crust of purity, the cost of permanence. And long after it's needed, long after it is used, long after it's understood, salt is still there.